Hey guys, tonight we're baking some historical insomnia straight from the ovens of pre-revolutionary France. Picture this. The streets of Paris still damp with morning fog, horse hooves clip-clopping over cobblestones, and the scent with smoke mixing with rising yeast. You're hunched over a massive wooden workbench, sleeves rolled up, dough sticking to your knuckles like sad wallpaper paste. And your back already aching, and it's barely 4 a.m. on a Monday. And honestly, you probably won't survive this shift. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The problem, you see, isn't just that it's Monday. The real issue is that it's Monday in 18th century France. And you, poor thing, are a baker, not a glamorous job, despite your very chic flour-covered apron. No, this is a calling made mostly of stress, soot blisters, and bread riots. And for you, Mondays are less about a fresh start and more like stepping into a guillotine made of croissant dough and unmet expectations. Monday in the 1700s wasn't just the first day of the work week. It was a weekly reckoning for bakers. Why? Well, because Sunday was a legally mandated rest day. You weren't allowed to bake fresh bread. That meant by Monday morning. Every stomach in Paris had grown impatient, and every customer was snarling, wielding coins like weapons, and demanding their morning loaf now. Imagine working in a city where bread isn't just food. It's currency, politics, religion, and mood stabilizer, all wrapped in a crusty exterior. And you, dear sleepy baker, are the gatekeeper to national stability. Mondays weren't gentle. They were warfare made of baguettes. The ovens, by then cold from Sunday's forced nap, needed hours to heat. The sourdough starter had sulked in a corner all night, neglected and moodier than a cat denied window access. There was no time for a proper pre-dawn rise, only frantic mixing, shaping, and bargaining with yeast to perform miracles under duress. And the worst part? You weren't alone in your suffering. Every other baker in town was in the same flour-dusted boat. Public ovens, still a common feature in many quartiers, created choke points for desperate professionals elbowing for space. It wasn't unheard of for minor scuffles to break out over oven time. Imagine a WWE match where the title belt is a fresh batard. But still, you soldier on. The first customers shuffle in, rubbing sleep from their eyes and muttering about crust texture like they have Michelin stars in their pockets. One particularly surly man demands a pain-to-do levers and frowns at the crumb structure like you insulted his mother. The stress climbs. The wooden paddle you use to load the bread into the oven feels heavier than usual. Your apprentice, barely 12, has already managed to knock over an entire sack of flour and is now sobbing behind a barrel. You hand him a day-old roll, like a peace offering. He takes it with shaking hands. Here's the thing. Bread in 18th century France wasn't optional. For most people, it made up 80% of their daily calories. So when the bakers weren't ready, especially on Mondays, it wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was social unrest with crumbs. And Monday? Monday was the reset button for that whole chaotic cycle. The supply chain of grain deliveries, milling, dough fermentation, and oven schedules had all been artificially paused by Sunday Sabbath regulations, which meant that Monday was like trying to fly a balloon that had been stomped on overnight and expected to ascend immediately, with pigeons strapped to the sides for lift. Now, some clever bakers found ways to cheat the system, prepping dough illegally on Sunday, keeping ovens warm in secret, bribing officials to look the other way. But if you got caught, oh boy, public shame, fines, and in some cases, loss of your bakery license, which was a huge deal because most bakers were part of tightly controlled guilds. And guilds, bless their flour-dusted hearts, were less about community and more about bureaucracy wrapped in crust. We'll get to them soon. For now, just know that the Guild of Bakers found out you've been illicitly proofing dough on the Lord's Day. They'd unleashed the flowery wrath of a dozen elderly men with strong opinions and weak knees. Now add this to the mental mix. France's economic system at the time wasn't exactly stable. There were famines. Grain prices fluctuated wildly. Bakers were accused of everything from hoarding to treason. A bad Monday, in other words, could trigger public rumors that you were purposefully starving the neighborhood. One crooked baguette, and suddenly the whispers start. He's in league with the merchants. He's baking to break us. Historians still argue whether this paranoia was truly widespread or simply amplified by pamphleteers and overzealous watchdogs. But the fear baked itself into every batch. Monday loomed as a symbol, not just of exhaustion, but of scrutiny. And speaking of scrutiny, here comes Inspector Dufresne, the neighborhood's bread enforcer. No, really that was a thing. We'll meet him properly later. But for now you just nod stiffly as he enters your bakery, weighing your loaves and tapping them ominously. He jots a few notes, scowls slightly, and vanishes like a judgmental breeze. You breathe out, finally, as the first round of loaves finishes baking. Steam billows as you slide them out of the oven, the golden crust crackling in the cold air. For a moment, it's almost beautiful. You hand a hot loaf to a waiting woman, her scarf wrapped tight around her head. She smiles just a little. Small victories. Mondays in the 18th century weren't just the start of the week. For French bakers, they were weekly exams. Pass/fail, with hunger as examiner and unrest as a consequence of bad grade. But for now, you've made it through the worst of the morning. And your reward? Starting the next batch. Immediately, your apron is stiff with flour. Not soft, friendly flour, the aggressive kind that forms crusts in your elbow folds and permanently whitens your eyebrows. You glance at the sticky mess on your work table. Another batch of dough waits, slumped in a bowl like it regrets its existence. And honestly, you kind of do too. The sun still hasn't fully cleared the rooftops, but the second wave of customers is already muttering outside. The worst part? This is normal. This is Monday. And if your arms feel like they've been replaced with overcooked noodles, well, so be it. You reach for your bowl of sourdough starter, a temperamental beast made of flour, water, and rage. It's been passed down for years, perhaps decades. Historians still argue whether some bakeries truly maintain lineages of sourdough starter for centuries, or whether they occasionally cheated and just started fresh after one too many microbial tantrums. But let's pretend yours is ancient. It makes a better bedtime story. It bubbles faintly. That's good. A living culture. Somewhere in that mixture is a yeasty, microscopic army that's decided, for now, to cooperate. You whisper something encouraging to it. Not that you're going mad. Just that if you don't bribe the dough spirits, you fear the loaves will come out flatter than a royal wig after rain. As you need, the rhythm soothes you a little. Push, fold, stretch. Again, the soft thump against the table sounds almost like a heartbeat. The dough grows springy, warm from friction and your half-chanted prayers. There's a certain intimacy to it, like cradling something that might someday feed a stranger who will never thank you. Behind you, your apprentice tries to stoke the fire. There's a hollow whoosh, and then the fire finally answers, flames flickering to life. You both nod silently. Victory. Now about those ovens. In most French towns during the 18th century, there was usually a communal oven, a four banal, originally owned by the local lord. Bakers had to pay a fee to use it, even if it was public. Over time, some bakers installed their own ovens, but many still depended on these shared spaces. And on Mondays, these spaces became the flour cake version of a Black Friday sale at dawn, crowded, tense, and full of awkward jostling. You, of course, are one of the lucky ones. You've saved enough sous to build a personal oven. It costs you your left shoulder and maybe your second marriage, but it's yours. Big, round, and soot-streaked like a beach whale who dreams of fire. It sits like a sleeping beast in the corner, occasionally exhaling smoky sighs. As the second round of loaves goes in, you permit yourself a rare moment of reflection. Not much of that in your line of work. But today, let's indulge. Why did Mondays become such cursed days for bakers, beyond the Sunday restrictions? Part of it was logistical lag. Your entire week hinges on grain delivery, which rarely happens over the weekend. The millers take their day off too. If your flour sack runs low by Saturday, you're out of luck until Monday morning, And that's assuming your delivery boy didn't spend the Sabbath forgetting his job over several mugs of watery wine. And then there's the customers. Oh, the customers. They come on Monday in moods. Stale Sunday bread has made them cranky. Maybe they had to soften it with wine, or cheese, or their own tears. But today, they expect fresh, fluffy heaven. And you have to deliver, or else face the wrath of Madame Fournier, who insists her bulls are denser than usual and might be trying to poison her. Bread's a little Republican this morning, she says, which is both an insult and a political jab. The joke's on her, it's 1740. The Republic won't show up for another half-century. But she's not wrong about the bread being rebellious. You apologize with theatrical sigh, offer her a free roll. She eyes you like a hawk at confession, then accepts it. Peace for now. There's something peculiar about the 18th century French relationship with bread. It wasn't just sustenance. It was almost sacred. For peasants and nobles alike, bread represented fairness, or lack thereof. When grain prices rose or bakers raised costs, riots followed. You weren't just selling baked goods. You were participating in a delicate social contract with your entire community. In fact, one fringe tidbit whispered among apprentices is that bakers kept emergency tunnels beneath their shops, not for storage, for escape, should a riot break out. There's not much solid proof, but some basements did have suspiciously narrow passages and hidden trapdoors. Historians still argue whether these were riot routes or just ambitious root sellers. Either way, it's a good reminder to stay on everyone's good side. You turn your attention back to the table, where your apprentice has once again made a mess. There's dough on the ceiling, dough on the cat, dough inexplicably in your coffee. You don't ask. You just sigh, wipe it off your cup, and take a sip of what is now possibly the world's first sourdough latte. Still, the kid's trying. He brings over a clean proofing basket, and together you shape the final round. Your hands move almost by memory. Tuck, stretch, turn. Repeat. Your knuckles are sore, but the rhythm is comforting. You could almost do this in your sleep. You've probably actually done it in your sleep. The bell above the door jingles. It's not a customer. It's your neighbor, old Jacques from the cheese stall. He hands you a wedge of yesterday's brie, smiles his 3-2 smile, and mumbles, "For courage!" You nod solemnly. You both understand the importance of emotional support dairy. You cut a slice and eat it slowly, leaning against a flour sack like it's a pillow. The bakery smells like with smoke, yeast, and faint despair. And still, it's somehow cozy, like a storm you've learned to dance inside. And yet, even as the worst of Monday recedes and the bread racks begin to fill, you know it's only temporary. The fear will return next Sunday evening, bubbling under your fingernails as you prep for another baking brawl. But for now, your loaves are warm, your customers have calmed, and your starter seems content. The oven crackles. You smile, just a little. Your hands are coated in a papery sheen of dried dough. Again, you peel it off in strips, like some kind of rustic skin ritual, and toss it toward a pail that's seen better decades. It misses. Whatever. The floor is already wearing a crust of flour thick enough to qualify as a small island. But even in this mess, there's a strange beauty. The sun has finally crept far enough over the rooftops to spill golden light through the cracked glass. It lands on the tops of your cooling loaves, giving them a glow that would make a cathedral blush. They sit in proud little rows like soldiers freshly knighted in sesame seeds. You sit briefly, on your favorite stool, the one with the uneven leg and a faint smell of cinnamon that no one can explain. You allow yourself a moment to breathe. Just one. Because Mondays weren't just hard. They were dangerous, especially if you messed up. See, back in the 18th century, French bakers were legally obligated to keep bread affordable. The price of grain might rise, but if your bread priced it too, you could be fined, imprisoned, or worse, humiliated in the town square. Sometimes they'd nail spoiled loaves to your door like a scarlet letter. One legend tells of a baker forced to parade his burnt bread through the market with a sign reading, "Beware the ash-fed baker." Again, historians still argue whether this was standard punishment or just one town's dramatic flair. You shake your head, imagining the shame. At least in your time, Your biggest public scandal is when you forgot salt last week and half the village started rumors that you were going blind, or cursed, or both. The truth is, baking wasn't always seen as noble. Respectable, yes, but dangerous in the political sense. Bread equaled power. Literally. When prices rose too quickly, riots broke out. One infamous flour war in 1775, just a stone's throw before the Revolution, began with whispers about bakers hoarding grain and ended with pillaged shops and burnt ovens. People didn't just want bread, they demanded it as a right. And you're the gatekeeper of that right. Congratulations. That explains why your shop's window has a small iron grate, just in case. You installed it after Madame Fournier's cousin threw a stale roll through your glass. She claimed it was self-defense. Speaking of grain, it's worth pausing on the raw stuff, the flour, your white powdery frenemy. Most bakers in your century relied on a local meunier or miller who ground wheat into flour using a water wheel or windmill. It sounds romantic, until you realize these guys were also notorious for skimming flour. Literally, miller fraud was so common, it inspired jokes, songs, and court cases. Some even added chalk or ground bones to stretch their product. You wince at the memory of that one sack you got last autumn, gray, lumpy, and suspiciously clumpy. You returned it immediately, even if your apprentice suggested maybe it was just fancy flour. He also tried to toast it. He still has no eyebrows. But honestly, it's not like you had many alternatives. The economy wasn't exactly thriving, and as a baker, you were stuck in a weird middle tier, higher than the peasants, lower than the merchants. Kind of like the sourdough of the social world. Complex, crusty, and occasionally left out too long. You rise with a groan and check your ledger. A few unpaid tabs. Nothing new. Most people settle their debts with favors, gossip, or cheese. Occasionally, someone tries to flirt for a free baguette. Once, a man serenaded your storefront with a lute. It did not work. Mostly because he only knew one chord and sang entirely in falsetto. You glance over at the clock. Well, not a clock exactly. More like a sunbeam shadow marker you rigged up after your actual timepiece broke in a dough-related incident. The shadow says you've got about an hour before the next round of bread hits optimal crust. Time enough to, perhaps, rest your eyes? But no, there's flour to sift. Always. You pull down the heavy sack from the shelf. It's almost as tall as you and filled with potential. The flour has to be aerated just right. Fluff like a pillow before an eternal nap in the oven. As you shake it through the sieve, clouds of white dust rise like soft ghosts. One lands squarely on your nose. Your apprentice laughs. You do not. Still, you suppose this is the part you enjoy. The quiet hum of your brain as it aligns itself to routine. The simple comfort of sifting, measuring, and folding. Even when your bones protest. Even when the air itself is more gluten than oxygen. In moments like this, you can pretend the world isn't outside. You're not thinking about taxes on grain, or the fact that the king's mistress apparently bought her own bakery just for the smell. Yes, that's a real rumor. Historians still argue whether Madame de Pompadour truly enjoyed bread, or just wanted another excuse to wear an apron trimmed with pearls. You, on the other hand, wear the same apron every day. It smells like home and hangs like armor. A slightly sad, flowery armor. You tie it a little tighter. Ready for round 2. The bell rings. You flinch, but it's not a customer. It's Lyon the butcher. He's holding a bundle wrapped in paper. For your trouble, he says, grinning. And because your apprentice tried to trade me half a roll for a pork chop, you accept the package. It's a slab of salted meat, luxury, in these parts. You nod, then glare at the apprentice, who pretends to be inspecting a crack in the wall. And just like that, your shop is full again. Not just of smells or sunlight, but of people, life, stories. Bread might be boring, but it binds. And in a town that runs on rumor and rye, your oven is its quiet, crackling heart. So you sigh, turn back to the fire, and keep feeding it. The hours pass like rising dough, slow, warm, and oddly satisfying. You lean against the counter, feeling the ache in your ankles settle into a dull hum, like a violin string someone forgot to pluck. Outside, the street is finally stirring. Carts rattle over cobblestones, a goat bleats in indignation for no reason, and a woman in a cherry-red bonnet argues with an invisible companion. Probably Monday, doing its usual chaos. You reach for your second favorite bread knife. Your favorite chipped yesterday when someone mistook it for a tool to pry open a barrel of pickles. That someone shall remain nameless, but his flour-dusted apron is currently hiding behind the shelves. You start slicing into the loaves. Not the fancy ones, no, just the simple bulls. Your signature, crusty on the outside, soft on the inside, and if you time the oven just right, they even make that hollow little thunk when you tap them, like a polite bread burp. Each slice releases steam that smells like toasted heaven. You pause to breathe it in. You do this a lot. Honestly, if anyone ever wrote a biography of your life, it would be titled Steam and Regret. The story of a sleep-deprived baker. Monday meant you had to be sharper, faster, and somehow less sweaty, though that last one never worked. Because, of course, Monday also meant inspections. Enter the inspector Dupain, the most feared, fussy little man to ever wield a ledger. The bread inspector. He's not here yet, but you can feel him coming. Like a storm, like judgment wearing knee-high stockings, and a frown carved from granite. His hat alone has more starch than your entire week's flour supply. And if your loaves don't pass, well, the town record once mentioned a baker who was forced to donate bread to a convent every week for 5 years. Another was made to publicly recite a poem about proper kneading technique on market day. Historians still argue whether these punishments were symbolic or just proof that the French have always been really into public embarrassment. You brush stray crumbs from your display and straighten your labels. Everything has to be precise, not just for the inspector, but for the guild. Ah, yes, the Baker's Guild. Picture it. A group of crusty old men and the occasional crusty old woman in stiff coats and powdered wigs, sitting in a smoky hall, arguing about crust ratios and yeast quality. They were powerful, connected, and absolutely terrifying. If they liked you, you got better flour. If they didn't, well, enjoy your shipment of slightly damp rye. And on Mondays, the guild often sent out secret shoppers, agents of fluff and vengeance, who buy your bread and then report on it. One famously claimed a baker's loaf was as dry as the bishop's sermons, and got him fined 3 sous and shamed in the local paper. Again, real? Maybe. Ridiculous? Definitely. Historians still argue whether these guild tattletales existed, or if bakers just liked having someone to blame for slow sales. You glance out the window. A shadow. Could it be? No. Just the town cooper, carrying a barrel on his head, like a feathered hat. You exhale. The inspector isn't here yet. You've got time. Your apprentice bumbles in from the back room, holding a basket full of oddly shaped loaves. One looks like a boot. Another, a melted turtle. You raise an eyebrow. Experiment, he says. Artisanal. You respond with a slow blink of someone reconsidering every choice that brought them to this exact moment in life. He retreats. You, meanwhile, return to shaping the next batch. Mondays require double batches. It's not just about selling. It's about being seen selling. Reputation is everything. Your crust is your calling card. Your crumb is your legacy. And heaven help you if someone finds a lump of unmixed flour in the middle. That's a one-way ticket to whispered rumors and passive-aggressive shade from Madame Collard, who once claimed her cat could make better brioche. You roll the dough into tight spirals, each one a little swirl of hope and anxiety. And just for fun, because you're not above a bit of superstition, you hum the old baker's charm under your breath. Rise with heat, stay soft within, crust like armor, crumb like sin. Does it help? Maybe. Historians still argue whether charms like these actually came from old monks or were just invented by bored apprentices desperate to explain why the sourdough exploded. Speaking of superstition, you catch sight of your lucky bread spoon. It hangs above the hearth, slightly singed but still intact. Legend says it once belonged to a nun who could knead dough with her eyes closed and still hit perfect hydration. You have no idea if that's true. But it's Monday, and frankly, you need all the help you can get. You glance at the door. It opens. There he is, the inspector, stiff as a breadstick, face like overproof dough. He glides in with the energy of a man who enjoys watching soufflés collapse. Behind him, his assistant, who, if rumors are to be believed, once shut down an entire bakery for using milk past the morning dew hour. He nods, doesn't speak, just removes a small silver tool from his coat, a kind of prong meat spatula contraption that he uses to tap the crust. Tink, tink, thud. He raises an eyebrow. Not good. He moves to the next loaf. Tap, tap, whisper. A pause. Then he nods. Barely. But it counts. You resist the urge to exhale too loudly. You don't want to disturb the mood. He scribbles in his ledger and moves on, out the door like a grim breeze. You think you hear the apprentice weep softly with relief behind a rack of croissants. And just like that, it's over. This week you passed. You survived another Monday. You stretch your arms above your head. The scent of roasted grain clings to your sleeves. The loaves cool, the sun shifts, and somewhere outside, a bell rings in approval. You smile, just a little, but only because Tuesday's bread is already rising in the corner, waiting for you to stop gloating. You let your smile fade, because smiling too long on a Monday tempts fate. And no one tempts fate in 18th century France, especially not when fate comes shaped like surprise guild audits and suspiciously wet sacks of flour. You've learned this the hard way. A soft thunk draws your attention. The apprentice, bless his flour-covered soul, is back with a tray of pastries that look like they've witnessed a crime. One has collapsed entirely. Another seems to be crying jam. Cherry turnover? He asks, too brightly. You tilt your head. Was it supposed to turn over? He blinks. You sigh. It's fine. Mondays are forgiving to no one. Even sugar has its limits. You turn your gaze back to the front of the shop. The customers trickle in now. Not the Sunday crowds. The elegant ladies with lace gloves and the men quoting Rousseau while eyeing each other's bread baskets. But the Monday regulars. Tired shopkeepers. Mothers with squirmy toddlers. A man who buys one roll and then complains about the price of shoes. These are your people. The quiet, crumb-hungry Monday faithful. You serve them with practiced rhythm, each coin clinking into the till like a lullaby of survival. The weight of early morning still clings to your bones, but your hands know the motions. Paper wraps, not ties, polite nods, occasionally a merci, madam, uttered with the exact amount of exhaustion that says, I am barely human until Wednesday. As you wrap a still warm baguette for a butcher's apprentice with dough under his fingernails, you remember Monday was also the day of secrets. The guild called it the quiet exchange, though no one used that name out loud. Too dramatic, too obvious. But you know, because at least once every Monday, a baker would pass another baker a pouch, a note, or a sample. Just a hint of something. A whisper of a new flour source. A scribbled tip on keeping dough soft in the humidity. Once, a small jar of lard, so pure it could have made your stale crust sing opera. These were precious exchanges, done behind baskets and beneath napkins. Sometimes they were even fake, to throw off the guild spies. Historians still argue whether the guild knew about these covert swaps. Some think they allowed it, to keep innovation alive in secret, far from politics. Others believe the guild was so mired in regulation and pride, it never noticed its members were low-key staging flower rebellions with every handshake. You take a moment to look at your own pouch, tucked under the counter. Inside, a small packet of caraway seeds. Exotic, scented like someone ground up a herb garden and a childhood memory. They arrived that morning, handed over by a friend who knew a cousin who once baked for a traveling poet. You plan to try them in a rye loaf tonight. If it works, you might have something new for Wednesday's crowd. If not, well, pigeons have to eat too. And this, oddly enough, is a heartbeat beneath the crust. Monday is when the real baking world turns. Because Sunday is for spectacle. It's a performance. Bread's tall and golden. Window displays clean enough to reflect a tax collector's soul. But Monday? Monday is where bakers talk. Experiment. Fail. Fail again. Steal inspiration. Swap horror stories. Sometimes even cry, though usually into their aprons, away from public view. You remember old Bernard from across the river. His Monday stories were legend. Once, he used powdered eggs by mistake and created what the market kids called the death muffin. Another time, his yeast starter collapsed like a flan in a thunderstorm, and he had to bribe a priest just to borrow a cup from the monastery stash. That starter, by the way, is still alive today, kept under a damp towel and spoken to gently every evening. Some say it's older than the mayor. Your apprentice interrupts your thoughts. He's holding a small list. Deliveries, he says, holding it like it might bite. You groan, because yes, Monday is also for deliveries. Not just incoming, but outgoing. Loaves for the school, rolls for the tavern. A mysterious order 12 mini brioches for someone who always signs their name LLEH and insists they arrive warm and tied with blue string. The deliveries are sacred pact. Not legally sacred, but emotionally so. You've never missed one, and you never will, because the one time someone did, the entire order ended up in the river, still wrapped, still warm. The fish were reportedly thrilled. As you prepare the packages, you think of all the other bakers doing the same stretch, the same wince at bending down, the same last-second panic that they forgot the salt again. Maybe it's comforting, in a way, like you're all part an invisible choir, singing off-key but in rhythm. Then a bell tinkles, and in walks Marguerite. Marguerite, your oldest customer, walks like she's lived through every type of bread crust. And maybe she has. She wears layers of shawls no matter the weather, and insists your rolls were better in 72, though she never says which century. She smells faintly of lavender and raw judgment. She scans the shelves, pauses dramatically, and picks a small rye. You used the good flour today, she says. You nod. About time, she adds and walks out. Compliment? Insult? Divine riddle? Historians still argue whether customers like Marguerite kept standards high or simply kept bakers humble. You lean toward both. The shop empties again for a moment. You finally sit, resting for exactly the time it takes a kettle to boil. You don't even drink tea. But hearing it whistle is the only alarm you allow in your life. You sip from your chip mug, lukewarm barley water, because coffee is expensive and dreams are for the rich. The silence hums. Outside, a street performer coughs theatrically. A dog pees against a lamppost with almost regal composure. Inside, you exist in that rarest of moments, the Monday lull. The next batch still needs a proof. The pie still needs scoring. But for this breath of time, there's nothing but you, the warm smell of crust, and a quiet that wraps around you like an old apron. And yes, you know it won't last. Not with lunch orders looming and the afternoon rush lurking just around the corner, like a baguette-loving monster. But for now, this lull is yours. And you sit with it. You, the Monday survivor. You, the flour-dusted alchemist. You, the keeper of caraway seeds and oddly shaped turnovers. Until the next bell rings. You glance at the clock, though you already know what it says. The hands have barely moved since Marguerite delivered her cryptic judgment. And the second tick is starting to feel personal. That's another thing about Mondays. They stretch. They don't rush. They ooze across time like spilled molasses on a cold marble slab. You could live a whole second life in the slow spaces between bread batches. Still, there's no escaping it. The afternoon lull is ending. And you know this not because the sun has shifted or because a rooster crowed twice, wrong continent, but because of a sound. The unmistakable rustle of school satchels and the distant thud of wooden saws. Children, spilling from schoolhouses like crumbs from an overfilled croissant. And that means snack hour is approaching. Now, back in your early baking days, you didn't take snack hour seriously. You thought, how hard can it be to feed small people pastries? Oh, sweet summer child. You learn quickly. Children are ruthless food critics. They don't care about your sleep deprivation or how long you fermented your dough. They will spit a tart back on the floor and say, it's too sticky, with the frankness of a revolutionary tribunal. One girl once told you your custard tasted like regrets. You still think about her sometimes. Today's snack lineup is modest but sturdy. Little hand pies filled with stewed apples, some sugar-dusted brioche buns, and a new experiment, almond oat biscuits shaped like animals. You try to do a duck. It looks like a haunted sock. Still, it's got crunch. The children like crunch. You set them out just as the first batch arrives. Sprinting, yelling, smelling faintly of ink and chalk dust. You brace. And then they're in, like pastry-seeking missiles. The duck sock is gone in seconds. A boy licks his fingers and declares, "You should make one shaped like Napoleon." He does not specify if he means the general or the pastry. You nod as if you'll seriously consider this. You won't. Amid the chaos, one of them, a quiet girl with a serious expression, stays behind after the others tumble out. "Do you like Mondays?" she asks. You blink. "No one likes Mondays." You reply, which might be the most honest thing you've said all day. She nods solemnly and leaves. Now you're thinking about it. Because here's the twist. Bakers didn't just dread Mondays. They feared them. Not metaphorically. Like actual fear. The kind that curdles your stomach and makes your hands hover over the dough just a little too long. Why? Because Monday was the official inspection day in many guild-run towns. Surprise visits by the flour police. If you will, imagine your elbows deep in sticky rye, and in walks a man with a curly wig, a sour expression, and a ruler, yes, an actual ruler, to check the size of your loaves. Historians still argue whether the inspections were genuinely about quality control or if they were just a form of economic theater. Some say it was a noble attempt to protect the public from dishonest bakers. Others point out that the guild masters often collected fees to look the other way. You know, like when Jock forgot to mill his flour properly and somehow passed with flying colors. Coincidence? Unlikely. You remember your first inspection. You had been up for 32 hours. You had flour in places no flour should be. And just as you finally pulled a perfect batch of croissants from the oven, there they were. 3 men, one with a clipboard, one with a monocle, one who looked like he hadn't smiled since Louis X.I.V.'s coronation. They measured everything. They sniffed things. One of them poked a loaf, sighed, and wrote something down. You didn't breathe until they left. When they finally did, you sat on the floor, surrounded by golden perfection, and cried into a bag of sesame seeds. Mondays, they leave a mark. The guild had very specific rules. The bread must weigh a certain amount. The crust must be properly browned. The flour must not be unmilled. Whatever that meant, it sounded made up. And heaven forbid your yeast starter smelled even vaguely suspicious. The penalties weren't always money. Sometimes, you were required to hang a sign on your bakery door for a week. This baker has violated the sacred trust of dough. In red ink, like a scarlet letter, but for gluten, there was also the dreaded bread tribunal. Okay, technically it wasn't called that, but it sounds better. Once a month, the guild would gather and discuss repeat offenders. The punishment ranged from a stern lecture to public shaming, or, if you were especially bold, temporary banishment from selling bread, which, for a baker, is like being told to run a tavern without beer, or raise pigeons without roof space. Not ideal. Still, you learn to adapt. Every Monday, you perform your own inspection before the guild can get to you. Loaves lined up like little soldiers. The crust, the grain, the size, all triple-checked. You develop what some might call a sixth sense for crumb structure. One glance, and you know if it's going to pass muster or start a scandal. One time, just before an inspection, you discovered your apprentice had mislabeled the flour bins. Your white flour was actually rye, and your rye was, well, no one's entirely sure what that sack contained. Possibly ground beans, possibly sawdust. You fixed it with 2 minutes to spare and never trusted a label again. And yet, oddly, you also kind of thrive under it. There's something weirdly invigorating about being tested, about knowing your bread has to be good enough to survive both Monday and bureaucracy, like sending a child off to school in their best shoes and hoping they don't get trampled during recess. And when you do pass inspection, when the guild man grunts approvingly or doesn't write anything at all, you feel it, that quiet, chest-deep pride that makes the aching knees and yeast-scented dreams feel worth it. And no one else sees it, of course. Not the children, not Marguerite, not even your apprentice. who still thinks yeast is a type of bird. But you passed Monday. You conquered the flour gods. You lived to bake another week. And as you clean up the remains of snack hour, crumbs in your apron, jam on your elbow, you let yourself hum, just a little, a crusty lullaby, maybe even in tune. Because sure, Mondays are chaos, but they're also the measure of a baker's soul. And as dust begins to settle like powdered sugar over the rooftops of your little quartier, you finally exhale. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, just a slow, almost inaudible one that eases from between your teeth when you realize the day didn't actually collapse on itself like an underbaked souffle. Your loaves passed inspection. The children didn't riot. No one cried in the butter vat. Marguerite only rolled her eyes once. So really a solid Monday. But don't get comfortable just yet. There's still dinner bread to prep. Because in 18th century France, no meal, not even Olympus cabbage stew or the fanciest pigeon pie, was complete without bread. Not just any bread either. Dinner bread was a statement. It was what separated the hungry from the merely bored. It needed to be soft, golden, and, if the patrons were wealthy, shaped into braids, knots, or something resembling the royal crest. You tried that once. It looked like a snail fighting a pretzel. So now you stick to what works. Round loaves. Rustic. Safe. Comforting. As you mix the dough for these final batches, your fingers instinctively follow the pattern. Scoop, press, turn, fold. It's like kneading your own heartbeat into something edible. Your mind drifts. You remember old Jean Claude, the baker who trained you. Beer like a cloud of flour, hands like tree bark. He once told you, if your dough sighs, let it. Don't rush it. Good bread needs time. Same as bad poetry and royal treaties. Jean-Claude, by the way, had strong opinions about royal treaties. He claimed the Treaty of Utrecht was the worst thing to happen to bread since pre-sliced loaves, though no one could ever quite connect the dots. Still, it was fun to watch him rant, waving a dough scraper like a sword. Now, here's a strange little fact. Some bakers believed the dough had moods. You'd hear them mutter things like, she's temperamental today, or, don't press too hard, he's sullen. Dough as a sentient creature. It sounds absurd, but after a while, you kind of get it, especially on Mondays. Because somehow the dough knows. It resists. It clings to your fingers. It develops holes that make no structural sense. Historians still argue whether this was due to temperature fluctuations, uneven fermentation, or just the collective despair of a post-Sabbath society. You suspect a combination of all three, and maybe a little dough-related rebellion. Dinner loaves also came with social baggage. In many towns, bakers were expected to deliver bread to prominent homes, a service called pain du soir. It was less here's your carbs, and more, please accept this subtle reminder that we know how to make things rise on command. You often had to walk the loaves over personally, still warm in their linen wraps, and hope the butler didn't turn up his nose at too dark crust. Some households even weighed the loaves. Weighed them, as if checking for moral character. One noble woman once sent yours back because it smelled too cheerful. That was the week you accidentally added orange zest to the dough. Never again. You glance at the dough. It's behaving. The rise is smooth. The stretch, elastic. It almost feels cooperative. That's when the bell rings. Not the front bell. The guild bell. A low, mournful clang that vibrates through the cobblestones. It only rings when something is amiss. You freeze, fingers mid-fold. Down the alley, a runner appears. Panting, red-faced, probably on his third unpaid errand today. He shouts something about a flour dispute. Something about the miller in the East Quarter selling adulterated product. Again, you sigh. You know what this means. Another round of panic inspections. A guild crackdown. And worst of all, baker gossip. Because, oh, the gossip. Forget salons and ballrooms. If you want information, listen to Bakers at Dusk. You'll hear everything from who's cheating on their yeast to who added water to their batter to stretch it one more loaf. You once heard a rumor that Antoine, who operates the shop 2 streets over, was secretly baking with imported grain from Italy. Scandalous. Possibly treasonous. Very gluttonous. He denied it, of course, but his crusts had that suspiciously golden glow. You always wondered. Back in your kitchen, you stoke the oven and think through your flour stash. Yours is local. You're sure you bought it directly from Old Man Bastian, who smells like oats and swears like a sailor. He may be grumpy, but he doesn't cut corners. Still, trust is a delicate dough. You prep the loaves anyway, just in case. You've lived through surprise guild audits before. You know what to expect. Long sighs, unnecessary poking, and one man who insists on tapping each loaf with his knuckle as if he's listening for secrets. And then a knock on your back door. Not the front. Not official. Just a knock. You open it to find a fellow baker, Elodie, from the Riverside Quarter. Her apron is streaked with ash. Her cheeks flushed. She's holding a sack. "Trade?" she asks, raising the sack like an offering. You nod, bartering flour on a Monday night. It's not exactly legal, but it's not legal either. Think of it as gray area carbohydrate diplomacy. You offer her a hunk of sourdough starter in return. She leaves with a wink. You lock the door. And you realize this too is part of the job. The quiet packs. The flour whispers. The unspoken understanding that Mondays aren't meant to be survived alone. The dinner loaves go into the oven. One by one, they swell and crack and brown at the edges, like stories coming to life under heat. You rotate the trays. You hum. Outside, the sky folds into indigo. The bell stops ringing. And inside your kitchen, the warmth from the hearth eases into your bones. No one said baking would be easy, but at least it smells like victory. By now, your knees are whispering dark threats, and the small of your back has turned into some kind of abstract sculpture, one that screams ergonomic nightmare. But the loaves are done. Golden. Splendid. No cracks in the wrong places. No burnt bottoms. And not a single one looks like it wants to cry. You line them up to cool, each one sitting proudly on the wooden rack like soldiers after inspection. Their crusts crackle gently as they release steam, a kind of post-bake sigh that tells you, yes, you've made it to the worst part of Monday. Probably. And just as you're about to lean against the wall, and maybe doze off with your eyes open, there's a commotion down the street. Loud voices. Hooves. A clatter like someone dropped a wheelbarrow full of copper pans. You shuffle over the window and peek out, careful not to be spotted, because in 18th century France, being spotted at your window while wearing an apron and looking nosy could get you labeled as a kitchen philosopher. That's not a compliment. That's someone who gossips more than they glaze. Turns out it's a flour inspector arriving late. Of course, the guild must have decided to do spot checks now that the day is nearly over, because what's the point of fear if it doesn't arrive slightly after bedtime? This particular inspector is known for his unusual interrogation tactics. Last year, he made one baker recite the Lord's Prayer backward while shaping a loaf to prove he was a man of both faith and gluten. You're not sure which part is more upsetting. You turn back to your work table, heart picking up speed, because if he chooses your shop, you'll need to explain everything. Your flour source, your water filtration, even your oven ash, which apparently was too woodsy last time. And yes, historians still argue whether guild inspections were about actual quality control or more about maintaining a very strict baking aesthetic. Aesthetic enforced, of course, by people who didn't bake at all. You wipe your hands and check the sacks of flour again. Still sealed. Still smelling of oats and integrity. Probably fine. But just as you begin to relax, the knock comes. Not the secret Elodie knock. Not the bell. The official knock. 3 quick raps, then silence. You open the door. The inspector is short, balding, with eyebrows that look like 2 sleeping cats. His cloak is dusted with flour. Whether his or someone else's, you'll never know. He steps inside like he owns oxygen. Evening, he says, not unkindly, but also not like someone who plans to leave quickly. He begins the inspection with your scales. Standard practice. He checks for counterweights. Hidden ones. There aren't any. You know better. He nods. Then your salt jar. He sniffs it. Licks a finger. Frowns. 2 course, he says. You smile politely. That's from the marshes near Garand. He grunts. And then Inevitably, the flour. He scoops a handful from your biggest sack and tastes it. Raw, like a man possessed. You have to look away. It's like watching someone eat sand at a picnic. He says nothing. Finally, he gestures toward your oven. You open it, heat blooming out in waves, and he inspects the ash, rubs some between his fingers. Beech, he asks. You nod, mixed with chestnut. He shrugs. Acceptable. Relief flickers through you, until he spots your starter jar. Name. You blink. Pardon? The starter. What's her name? Ah, one of those inspectors. You smile again, the kind you reserve for customers who say, my cousin in Lion bakes better. Josephine, you lie? He nods solemnly. Mine's called Bridget. Then, as if the conversation never happened, he hands you a parchment. Passed. For now. And with that, he leaves. You close the door slowly. Lock it. Slide to the floor and let your head rest against the cool wood. Your heart's racing like you just outran a butter thief. But you passed. You're safe. No fines. No sanctions. No public shaming in the square. Which reminds you of that time, 2 winters ago, when a baker from Rouen was paraded through the streets with a moldy baguette tied around his neck. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Also yes. People stopped using stale yeast for at least 6 months. You stand up, brush yourself off, and get back to work. Because passing inspection doesn't mean you're done. Now it's time to prep for the early buyers. These are the people who show up at dawn, not for loaves, no, but to make sure you're making them. The dough guardians, as Elodie calls them. Older women with sharp eyes and louder shawls who believe their neighborhood's reputation hinges on your rising buns. They will knock on your window at 6, and if you aren't awake, they will tap again, and again, until your soul peels off the ceiling. So, you set out ingredients for the morning. You refill the salt jars. You clean the kneading table, rubbing it down with cloth soaked in warm vinegar, because that's what Jean-Claude said kept yeast demons away. You're 80% sure he made that up. Still, you do it. Outside, the street is finally quiet. The inspector's cart rolls into the darkness. Someone in the next alley sings softly to their cat. And back inside your bakery, you light one more candle, just to keep you company. Mondays are cruel, but they're also a test. And you, tired, flower-streaked, slightly delirious you've passed. You survived the worst day in a baker's week. And tomorrow, you'll do it again, just with fewer guild officials. Hopefully, you don't really fall asleep so much as collapse into a nap with your eyes open. You're perched on a low stool, head resting against a sack of flour, like it's a feather pillow from Versailles. The candle is burned halfway down, casting long shadows that wobble every time a mouse sneezes in the rafters. And yet, even in this half-conscious state, your ears remain tuned for the telltale double tap at the window. It's not the inspector this time. Not some wild-eyed noble demanding an emergency brioche at 3 a.m. No, this is something worse. Something more personal. It's Agathe, the shawled enforcer of Rue Ducel. She used to be a midwife. Now she's the unofficial gatekeeper of all things crust-related. And on Mondays, she starts her rounds at dawn or slightly before if she's feeling extra righteous. You'd think the sun obeys her schedule. Knock, knock. There it is. You stagger upright, joints creaking like old doors, and shuffle over to the window. Agathe peers in, eyes narrowed, cheeks red from the cold, and, presumably, from being fueled by pure spite and raisin brandy. You open the pane just a crack. Bread, she asks. Coming. You mumble. She doesn't move. You close the pane and get to work. There's no time for a second rising today. You prepped the dough last night. Remember that fevered haze around 1 a.m.? So now it's shaping, scoring, and, if the yeast gods allow, sliding it all into the warm mouth of the oven before Agathe declares you a fraud and walks directly to City Hall with a strongly worded letter. As you need, the world outside stirs. Horses clip-clop over wet cobblestones. Someone throws open shutters and curses in a whisper that still manages to sound elegant. A child screams about buttons. Monday. You peek outside again. There are more of them now. The bread vigil has begun. You see Claude, the candle seller, who always buys a roll and never pays the full price. Sabine, who insists she can taste dishonesty in a crumb. And lurking by the fountain is old Monsieur Roux, who hasn't actually chewed anything in 5 years, but still sniffs every loaf like it holds the secrets to eternal life. Your loaves are rising nicely. You wish they wouldn't, because once they're baked, it's showtime. And you remember, faintly like a dream, that today is also the day the tax officer visits. His name is Alphonse. He smells like licorice and questionable paperwork. He believes strongly in bread as a civic indicator, and he always asks questions like, do your loaves weigh the same on windy days? You're never sure how to answer. Historians still argue whether these kinds of flour taxes were intended to fund public works or were just an elaborate excuse to punish bakers for having slightly more popularity than the mayor. Anyway, you don't have time to fret. The loaves go in. The heat surges. You count the minutes. Agath's shadow looms larger. When you finally slide the door open and pull the first tray from the oven, there's a collective intake of breath outside. They can't see the bread. Not yet, but they can smell it. Crust, yeast, that faint tang of sourdough dignity. You carry the tray carefully, like it contains newborns or extremely fragile politics, and open the shop's half door. The crowd surges, politely of course, but also with elbows. Agath gets first pick. She squeezes a loaf, nods, grunts something that could be approval or early stage choking. Claude takes 2 rolls and winks. You sigh. Monsieur Roux sniffs, eyes you, sniffs again, wanders off muttering, acceptable, but less philosophical than last week, which is weirdly fair. And just when you think the madness is over, a carriage pulls up, silk curtains, gilded trim, a coat of arms you recognize from the time a noble tried to pay you in perfume. Out steps a young man, in embroidered boots and too much cologne. He says one word, cake. You stare at him. No cake, you say. He blinks, as though this outcome was inconceivable, then gestures behind him where a powdered servant produces a tiny velvet pouch. Truffles, the man offers. Still no cake. He storms off in a huff that smells like cinnamon and betrayal. Back inside, the loaves are flying off the racks. You sell out before the clock hits 9. Agath disappears without another word, leaving behind a single stray raisin on the doorstep. And then, just like that, it's quiet again. You slump against the counter. Your hands ache. Your eyes sting. Your apron is now 80% bread dust and 20% existential dread. But Monday, well, the worst of it is done. Except you hear something, a whisper of wheels, the creak of well-oiled hinges, that lingering scent of licorice. Alphonse! He enters without knocking, tipping his hat like you're both actors in a poorly rehearsed tragedy. Good morning, he says. You nod. Lovely smells. You nod again. Do you keep receipts for your flour mill purchases? You pause. Not because you don't. You do. Neatly, filed under definitely real ledger, behind the spice jars. But you pause because, at this point, your brain has turned into wet pastry. He takes out his notebook, asks questions, sips the tea you didn't remember serving him. You endure, and by the time he leaves, noting that your inventory appears slightly optimistic, you're back at the prep bench, measuring out flour for tomorrow's bake. It never stops. The bread, the rules, the inspections, the lace-cuffed customers who think ovens run on gratitude. Still, you bake, because even though Mondays in 18th century France are terrifying, full of knocks and taxes and unpredictable nobles, they're also proof that you matter. The city wakes up to your work. Your loaves feed its gossips and its thinkers. Your buns cradle the morning silence. You stretch, finally, yawn, look at your poor blistered hands. And you think maybe, just maybe, next Monday won't be so bad. You're wrong, of course, but you think it anyway. Word count, 1,099. You really should be napping now, or lying face down in a patch of barley until spring. But instead you're scrubbing down the work table with a rag that smells like vinegar and old ambition. It's a French Monday, after all, which means the chaos of morning always leaves a few flour ghosts behind. You chase a clump of dough hardened like antique plaster across the corner of the bench and wonder, vaguely, why it's shaped like a tiny screaming man. The bakery is quiet. Just the low ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of timber beams sighing under their own ancient weight. You glance up at the slanted ceiling. Someone in the apartment above drops something heavy, probably a cabbage or a cat, and the dust shivers down. You could leave, go out, walk along the Seine, and try to remember what trees look like. But no, there's work. There's always work. Because Tuesday's bread doesn't shape itself. And neither do the records the guild requires from bakers who dare to earn money. Without the proper ink, you sit, reluctantly, and open the big ledger. It smells like glue, mold, and disappointment. Now here's the fun part of your job no one talks about in heroic village fables. The Boulangerie records. Every crumb you bake must be accounted for. Each ounce of flour tracked. Each batch recorded. If one single crust goes unregistered and someone reports you, it's a fine, a warning, or, in extreme cases, a brief but soul-crushing visit from the flour office. Historians still argue whether these overzealous bread audits were driven by real fears of famine or just the government trying to assert control over anything remotely comforting, like a well-browned baguette. You dip your quill in ink. Note the morning's totals. Pause at unsold inventory and draw a discreet frowny face instead of the zero you're supposed to write. You consider embellishing a bit. No one checks that carefully, right? But then you remember Alphonse's licorice breath and think better of it. Still, some bakers did cheat the records, especially on Mondays, especially when the dough misbehaved. There's one infamous case of Montargis, where a baker tried to mask under-baked rolls by stuffing them with slightly cooked gooseberries. Locals still refer to it as Lupin Comment, the bread that lies. Sounds romantic. Was not. Anyway, you finish the ledger. Stretch. And now, finally you can think about sleep. But first, just to punish yourself emotionally, you review the baker's calendar. It's hand-inked, cracked at the corners and full of horrors like Lent begins, reduced butter by law, quarter inspection, sweep chimney before dawn, royal holiday, shape loaves into fleur-de-lis, again, and circled in red ink, next Monday equals bread fair, capital letters. The bread fair isn't as fun as it sounds. No one juggles pretzels. It's more of a parade of scrutiny. Every baker in the district is required to present a representative loaf to the regional administrator, not the mayor, not the church. No, the administrator, a man so dry he's rumored to be allergic to moisture and emotion. This loaf must be perfect. Crisp crust, airy crumb, uniform slashes, bonus points for symbolic flair. Like one baker who once shaped his dough into a tiny rearing horse. He was applauded, then banned because it was too whimsical. You sigh. That's future you's problem. For now, you pull out a heel of leftover bread, one no one wanted, and spread it with a smudge of apricot jam. It's dry, sure, but it's still warm at the center. Still yours. You chew slowly. And that's when you hear the second knock of the day. This one, softer, less righteous, more uncertain. You creak the door open. It's a boy, tiny, runny nose, clutching a cloth bundle like it contains state secrets. He holds it out to you. My mother says, she says we'll pay tomorrow. You look inside. 2 eggs, cracked, a few herbs, a button. You glance down at the boy, then back at the bundle, then at the empty rack behind you. 1 roll remains. Crust lopsided, probably laughed at by Sabine earlier. You hand it to him. He grins like he's been handed Versailles, runs off barefoot into the fog. You pause, stare out at the street. Think about how Mondays always seem designed to test your boundaries, and occasionally sneak past them wearing the face of a child. You close the door. Now really time for rest. You climb the steep wooden stairs to the narrow room above the shop, where your mattress is thin and smells faintly of burnt cinnamon. You flop down fully clothed, boots and all, because honestly, taking them off is a Tuesday task. You close your eyes, and that's when you hear it. Another knock. You contemplate launching yourself out the window, but instead, you get up, grumbling into your collar, and stagger back downstairs. It's Claude. "I forgot my second roll," he says, far too cheerfully. You hand it over, no words, and shut the door before he can wink. Back upstairs. Again. Collapse. Again. You let yourself drift. Just a bit. Your body humming with the rhythm of mixing, kneading, shaping, waiting. The quiet alchemy of yeast and time. You dream of clouds that rise like loaves. And somewhere deep in that dreamscape, you hear a tiny voice, Sabine, maybe muttering that your crust is fine but emotionally flat. You smile just barely, because even on the worst Monday, you baked, and that's more than enough.